Only about 2.5 months had passed since those days when I led the regiment that had broken out of the encirclement in the partisan region through these places. The period is not long, but how much the whole situation has changed. The grandiose success of the Red Army at Stalingrad filled the hearts of all Soviet people with strong faith in the imminent victory, and among the occupiers sowed the strongest anxiety, finally undermined the blind belief in the invincibility of the armies of the Third Reich. The former commander of the Spanish fascist Blue Division, which stood in those days near Leningrad, Esteban Infantes in his memoirs writes, "We lived at that time the expectation of the upcoming offensive on Leningrad. Confident in victory, we were looking forward to the start of the upcoming operation, but suddenly came the first reports of the Battle of Stalingrad as soon as we realized the defeat of the Germans and saw that the German troops were withdrawing from our section of the front to the south. We realized that the course of the war had changed and we would not attack. Heavy artillery units left first, then infantry divisions, transports, etc. With an unknown task, they were heading to the southern front. On our section of the front remained only divisions intended for defense. These divisions soon had to experience the strongest blow of the Red Army. January 12 began, and 6 days later, on January 18, ended with a brilliant success, the largest operation near Leningrad since the beginning of the war. The blockade ring was the occupiers thought less and less about new victories. Their main concern was to hold on to what they had captured. Their former confidence and impudence were gone. They were losing initiative. There was a shift, and in the consciousness of those Russians who were in the service of the enemy, ye the police soldiers Vlasovci, all those who in one way or another abetted the fascist regime. Hundreds of them were now looking for partisans not to fight us, but in the hope of getting a chance to redeem their guilt. The Hitlerites' attempts to plug the gap, created by the departure of some of their formations to the southern front with eastern units and Rower troops, into which they were recruiting intensively, Secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee MDN, Nikitin, in a report to the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party role. The broad campaign launched by the fascists to create a Russian liberation army headed by the traitor Vlasov failed. After Vlasov's speech at a rally in Didovichi, citizens said among themselves, "Damn him and his army of volunteers." There were no volunteers, except for a few. Mobilization is forced. Many are fleeing to the partisans and the forest. In the Playevsky district, reports the head of the Luzhsky Center, out of 100 people summoned to the draft board in the Zaplyotsky parish, not a single volunteer was found. Other leaders of party centers and partisan brigades report the same attitude towards the creation of the Vlasov army. Therefore, the Germans and Vlasov order to declare prisoners of war volunteers, enrolling them in their army. Vlasov's officers came to our camp, lined us up and announced that everyone was enrolled in the Russian Liberation Army. Those who didn't want to were offered to raise their hands. Those who raised their hands were shot here in front of the line. According to our comrades, many soldiers deserted from the volunteer army, and most of them were in the mood to join the Red Army at the first opportunity. And another characteristic detail, Hitler's henchmen now had to fear not only the return of the Red Army, not only the partisans, but also their own fellow villagers, who more and more often punished the traitors themselves. Here is just one example. In the area of Soroti in the fall of 1942, we recruited one of Hitler's henchmen, who had a rather large rank, the village headman. We agreed with him about the password and warned him that we would not be ceremonious if we saw him playing a double game. We could see that this man was very cowardly, afraid of both us and the Germans. We did not count on him especially. We knew that people of this kind only take the side of the one who is stronger at the moment, and the enemy was still very strong in the fall of the 42nd. But being in the Rugodevsko forest again, I still ordered our scouts to find this man, and quite unexpectedly we began to receive from him information of such value, which was difficult to even dream of. And the box simply opened. In one of the visits of our contacts to him, this man, who had every reason to count on the special patronage of the Nazis, said that often sleeps in haystacks. Every night he was inventing new and new ways to hide from the people whom he was now deathly afraid of. They had tried to kill him several times already, and there was never a moment when he felt safe. None of this meant, of course, that the days were easy for us. There were none until the very end of the war. Still, we were seeing important changes. They reflected those features that would later be noted as characteristic of the time of transition to the second period of the Great Patriotic War. A decisive turning point was coming in the battle against Hitler's fascism. It was time to sort out the affairs that had been done by the sabotage detachment, which had been wandering somewhere for almost a month after the death of its commander, which had gotten loose in these wanderings, lost both vigilance and discipline. By his grace, the regiment had to take an unexpected battle, and then left the Rugodevsky forest, no longer thinking of attacking the garrison in Vyborg. And after all, the preparation for this operation took from us a significant amount of time and effort. In addition, during the battle with the Punishers, our saboteurs showed a completely unexpected modesty. Their actions were so sluggish, uninitiated and cautious that I had to leave the command post for a while and myself to lead the battle in this area. Kazakov proposed to disband the detachment, distributing the sabotage groups evenly among the other units of the regiment. Stepanov thought it was better to keep the detachment. He said that the rambling and indiscipline, a consequence of the loss of the commander, and that by appointing good leaders in the detachment, we will achieve much more, while preserving a large combat unit of undeniable value. This opinion eventually won out. However, for educational reasons, we were a little tricky. Having ordered to build a squad, I, already on crutches, went out to him and gave him a full-form lecture. I spoke sharply, not shy in expressions, called all their art with their own names. The guerrillas stood silent, with their heads down. Combat awards, listening on the chest of almost everyone, were now like a reproach. Just a short time ago, everyone talked about the courage and bravery of these people, but now they have nothing to say when they are reprimanded like boys. They felt their guilt and were ready to be punished. And yet, when I said, deciding to scare harder, that the regimental headquarters has decided to disband the detachment, there was a murmur in the ranks, and then, after the traditional any questions, the partisans one by one began to ask for the preservation of their unit. They promised to atone with blood, asked for any other punishment. I felt that the 4th detachment would not give us any more trouble. Coming to the village of Savo, we tried, as it had been planned before, to organize on the lake near it to receive planes. However, because of the bad weather for several days, it could not be done. The wounded were in agony, especially bad was. Perhaps Sevstikov, been pale, completely unlike himself. It was painful to look at him. And what a handsome fellow he had been only a few days ago. Vasya did not know that he would be a cripple forever, that he would no longer be able to walk on partisan trails, not to run on skis, not to dance dashingly at parties. When he was cured in the hospital, he was declared unfit for military service, demobilized. He would leave for his homeland. And yet he will not stand it, will return to Valdai, find me in the headquarters of the guerrilla movement, where I will be working by then and asked to find a case for him. So we'll be together again, until the end of the war. In the meantime, he was lying in a hot-heated hut, delirious. When he came to his senses, he was silent, staring at the ceiling, thinking about some. My affairs became very bad. I couldn't sleep for several nights because of severe pain in my leg. The foot started to turn black. I asked the doctor to open and clean the wound, but the commissar intervened and forbade the operation, for which, to be fair, there were no conditions at all. Finally, on the night of January 24-25, the pilots managed to land 2 P-5 planes on Lake Nevereshskoy. All the wounded, including myself, were evacuated to the Soviet rear. With my departure, Mikhail Viktorovich Stepanov took command of the regiment. For the first time, I crossed the front line not on foot, not, as usual, walking along deep forest paths, through swamps, forcing, as it will be necessary, water obstacles, escaping from pursuit, looping through the forest to throw the enemy off the trail and thus passing dozens of extra, and therefore especially long kilometers. Of course, it cannot be said that the air road through the front is devoid of risk. The planes were fired at from the ground, they were caught by Messerschmitts, and yet I had a feeling that I was safe already when the stretcher on which I was lying, loaded into the plane. The engine was murmuring. It was dark in the cabin. I lay there and thought about what our regiment had managed to do for 43 days spent behind enemy lines. It turned out not so little. On the way to the new area and in the first days, in the new place we destroyed in battles more than 180 Hitlerites. We let the military echelon, consisting of 5 passenger cars and 9 platforms with tanks, fall off. We blew up 2 bridges on the highway Porkov, Sorokin, cut over 300 meters of communication lines, burned 110 tons of hay and 30 tons of straw, prepared by the Nazis, seized 8 tons of rice, oats, barley, and peas, liquidated the administration of Rugodevskaya Volost, seizing all documents in it. Besides, among the local population was organized the collection of means for building of tank column Leningrad partisan. Kolkhozniki handed us 26,000 rubles, which we transported to the Soviet rear. The airplane went to land. When the door opened, I saw Alexei Alexeyevich Tushikov before anyone else, standing quite close to me, ahead of the comrades who had come to meet us. He hugged me tightly, kissed me, escorted me from the airplane to the ambulance, but we had time to exchange only a few phrases. The door slammed shut, and the car rolled to the Yedrov hospital. The large frontline hospital in Yedrovo near Valdai, where we were brought from the airfield, was buzzing. All the wards were talking about one thing: the victory of the Red Army at Stalingrad. The figures known from the reports of Sovinform Bureau were discussed at every turn, and they were truly grandiose. Only 91,000 Hitlerites were captured at Stalingrad, including 24 generals headed by Field Marshal F. Paulus and 2,500 officers. The military hospital is not a rest home. Many of those lying here were crippled by the war for life, and not only physical suffering they experienced, a person who suddenly became an invalid, tormented by moral suffering caused by the consciousness of their own inferiority. Yesterday's boys, who had no time to run and dance, who only once ineptly hugged their girlfriends, and that was goodbye, goodbye. Their bodies were crushed by shrapnel. In overcrowded field infirmaries, they were bent over by doctors who would be glad to help but could not. And then from the operating rooms of frontline hospitals they were carried on gurneys, some without arms, some without legs. They were ashamed of their stumps. They became irritable and intolerant. They suffered themselves, and it was a torment for others to see them suffer. Saying there is no need to continue this topic. Military hospitals were places of concentrated pain, concentrated physical and moral torment of people, and it seems to me that a detailed account of all this always contains a fair share of sadistic cruelty, perversity, even sacrilege. I spoke about the suffering of the wounded, only to emphasize the following thought. Even the most severe of them, learning about the Stalingrad victory, forgot about their pain. So great was the significance of what had happened. And how many days, nights, weeks, and months? Hard, agonizing. We waited for this day. In the exhausting battle with the enemy, a radical turning point had occurred. It did not mean, of course, the end of the war, but it became clear to the whole world. Hitler's fascism could not withstand the fight with the Soviet Union, and we were proud of our country, the first and only one to deliver such a crushing blow to the hated Hitlerism, whose military machine suppressed almost all of Europe. In none of the other countries did not meet a worthy response. No, none of us could not be absorbed by our own pain in those days. We greedily caught every report of the Sovinform Bureau. We learned that the enemy had lost 1.5 million people at Stalingrad, over 10,000 guns and mortars, up to 2,000 tanks and assault guns, about 2,000 airplanes. We watched with bated breath how, by order of the Supreme Command Headquarters, active combat operations of the Red Army were unfolding on the entire 1,000-kilometer stretch of the front line from blockaded Leningrad to the Black Sea and the Caucasus. From November 24, 1942 to January 20, 1943, Velikolukskaya, and almost simultaneously with it Rozhevsko-Sychevskaya offensive operations were carried out. In February 1943, our troops captured Voroshilovgrad, Kramatorsk, and Rostov. At the same time, significant forces of Hitlerites were defeated in the Nalchiko-Stavropol and Krasnodar operations, during which most of the North Caucasus was liberated, and the enemy was thrown back to 500-600 kilometers. In February, the Voronezh and Bryansk fronts completely defeated the Ostrogozhsko-Rossishanskaya and Voronezh-Kastornenskaya groups of enemy troops. On February 8, the Soviet troops liberated Kursk, on February 9, Belgorod, on February 19, Kharkov. January 1943 brought joy to the besieged Leningrad. The ring of the enemy blockade was finally broken. The city received the first railroad trains with food, and soon it became clear to all of us, who were in the Yedrovo hospital, that new events were brewing on our northwestern front. We stayed in Yedrovo only a few days, and then suddenly and hastily we were transferred first to the hospital, located about 50 kilometers east of Bologoy Station, and from there just as soon we were loaded into a sanitary train and taken further to the east. It became clear to everyone that the frontline hospitals were being freed to receive significant new batches of wounded, which could be only in the event of a major offensive, so it is planned and will begin very soon. We learned about the offensive on the northwestern front when the sanitary train took us farther and farther away to the Urals. In February, March, our troops defeated Demian grouping of Hitler's 16th Army. The sanitary train was leaving to the east. One evening it stopped at the station Kotenich, and all of us, accustomed for 2 almost years of war to a thorough light disguise, were completely amazed by the sight of brightly shining lanterns on the platform and the windows of houses, from which the light of electric lamps poured into the street. A small station could not, of course, be lighted in any special way, but it seemed to all of us that we were seeing a veritable sea of fire. How beautiful it was! The war, whose presence we had always felt everywhere, suddenly seemed like a long-gone thing that would never be returned to. The hardships and sufferings, the deprivations and losses, the deaths and injuries, the cold and hunger, the feeling of constant danger and the constant tension of nerves. All this seemed to melt away in a bright electric light. This sensation can only be compared to that which comes at the moment of the disappearance of a long and acute pain. A person is already accustomed to it, knows that it will not go away soon, tries to think about it as little as possible, and suddenly, he realizes that here it is happiness, a special happiness that brings amazing pleasure to the soul, the happiness of the subsided pain. Maybe not all the people in our echelon experienced this feeling, but I saw quite clearly that the very atmosphere of our carriage became different. Even the severely wounded stopped moaning. Even those crippled by war became calmer. Even the nurses and orderlies, tired from sleepless nights and endless worries, began to seem less tired. And then the wagons began to be gradually emptied. The wounded were placed in hospitals located on the way of the train. Finally, in the city of Kirov, they took me out of the carriage. Then, travelling from hospital to hospital, moving further and further east, I lost all contact with my comrades. I knew nothing about how things were going in my regiment, or in general about how the Leningrad partisans were fighting. The hospital routine was an endless succession. Back in Yedrovo, I had an operation. It turned out that I had a damaged heel bone. Dressings, procedures. Then it turned out that the operation was unsuccessful. I had a second operation, and again bandages. Again I had to learn to walk, first leaning on crutches, and then overcoming pain without. In short, I returned to Valdai only on the 20th of March. My leg was still painful. I walked with a stick, so I received an order to rest. And just in these days, suddenly, completely unexpectedly for all of us, news. On March 25, 1943, Nikolai Grigorievich Vasiliev died in Vishnevolotsk military hospital. The coffin with his body was brought to Valdai, and all the partisans who were here at that time came to see the commander off on his last journey. He was buried in the very center of the city, in front of the House of Culture. There was a funeral meeting. One after another people went up to the podium, spoke about the contribution to the partisan struggle against Hitler's fascism, which made Nikolai Grigorievich. From the first day of the war, in the rear of the enemy, he did not let the weapon out of his hands, bravely, honestly and selflessly served the people who entrusted this weapon to him. We did not hide our tears. We vowed to keep in our hearts forever the memory of this man, a steadfast soldier of the motherland who gave his life for her and never thought of any privileges for himself, except the unconditional right to fight against her enemies. Some of Vasiliev's letters to his family have been preserved and later published. Here is one of them, to his wife, written on October 10, 1942, just in the days about which I wrote above. Nikolai Grigorievich was then in a huge trouble, but he never said a word about the injustice, the poison of which poisoned his soul. Over the past 2 months, I and my comrades have lived a lot and can hardly repeat in life. Only the Russian people in the struggle for the motherland are able to fight and endure such hardships and inhuman deprivations. We fought with fascist bastards to the last cartridge, to the last breath, but we came out victorious. I'm resting with my comrades. As soon as I get on my feet and get stronger, I'll come to you. I ask you, Mother and Father, not to worry about my health. Nothing terrible happened. We were in difficult conditions for several weeks, but the fascists were beaten relentlessly. I got a little exhausted and caught a cold. As soon as I get up and get stronger, I will be with you soon. My temperature is normal. I'm slowly starting to walk. My legs are getting stronger. Once again, I ask you, my Mother and Father, not to worry about my health. My strength will be restored quickly. Soon the hour will come when we will be together. I got your letter, thank you. Well, I think that's it. Wait for me. Soon I'll be in Orin. Kisses Kaulia. He could not come to his wife, who worked in one of the military hospitals, not having had time to recover from the disease he wrote about. Vasiliev again led his brigade to the rear of the enemy. At the funeral meeting, a radiogram was read out. March 26, 1943. We do not have the opportunity today with our own hands to wreath and cover with flowers the grave of our wonderful commander, but the time will come. This grave will be a holy place for us. We swear before the ashes of our friend and battle comrade to hold high the honor of the 2nd Partisan Brigade. Our formidable blow to the enemy, who destroyed 608 fascists in the last battle, is a battle salute at the grave of our beloved Nikolai Grigorievich Basil, on behalf of the partisans and partisan women of the 2nd Brigade. Rachkov, Orlov. Nikolai Grigorievich passed away very early in life. I am sure that if he had lived until the end of the war, and there would not have been among the Leningrad partisans a man more honored, respected, known and loved by all. He did not recognize that the motherland marked his services with the highest award, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. What a ruthless word, posthumously. Let the memory of our combrig be forever alive. Every day I came to the task force to find out news about my regiment. I followed his actions very closely, and things were going well there, apparently not bad. Despite losses in frequent battles, the regiment was constantly growing, accepting volunteers from local residents and former prisoners of war who had escaped from the camps. In those days, the partisan regiments and detachments began to accept even former Vlasovites and Polizei, who had already joined the partisans by the dozens in an effort to atone for their guilt before the motherland. The detachments became large. Their number reached 200–250 people. Another 5th detachment was formed, commanded by Pierre Novikov, who arrived from the Soviet rear. This detachment was trained, armed, and then was sent, as they said in the regiment, to practice, to raid along the railroad and highway Pskov. Partisans destroyed the road, blew up bridges, broke telephone and telegraph communication. The regiment was engaged in active fighting. Our men smashed commandant's offices, blew up warehouses, organized sabotage on communications. Traffic on the highways Novorshev-Vybor-Ostrov and Porkhov-Ostrov was systematically disrupted. Enemy convoys moved here only under heavy guard. One of the most interesting operations of those days was a raid on the enemy garrison in the village of Morozi. It was made in early February and deserves, in my opinion, a separate story. This raid was preceded by the following events. The regiment was then located in the area of the same village of Sivio, where I left it. It was carrying out active sabotage work on the Pskov-Ostrov railroad section. One after another, small special groups went on missions, which on the way to the railroad crossed a large road between the villages of Morozi and Marshovitsi. Soon, however, our saboteurs began to disappear without a trace or suffered heavy losses. In the area of Morozi, they often fell into Hitlerite ambushes. It was decided to defeat the garrison of this village by night raid. A few days, a thorough reconnaissance was carried out. It was found that the garrison consisted of about 150 men, including 20 cavalrymen, that it had 2 or 3 machine guns and as many light mortars, that the garrison consisted not only of German soldiers, but also largely of Polizei. Every morning a group of 15–20 men, usually Polizei, would leave the village and set up an ambush in the forest, each time in a new place. If the partisans did not come across the ambush during the day, it was replaced in the late evening by another group of the same size. Within a few days, as a rule, some of the guerrillas were trapped. One of the scouts, Sasha Maltsev, proposed a daring but extremely interesting plan, risky but promising minimal losses with maximum results. After a thorough discussion at the regimental headquarters, it was accepted for execution. To make a raid was assigned to a detachment of PA. Klimov, reinforced by 2 machine guns and a platoon of mortars. At night, the detachment approached the village and settled on the edge of the forest meters, in 500 meters from the outskirts of the village, waiting for the signal. A little earlier, a group of scouts of 20 people led by Maltsev in 2 kilometers from the village settled down in an ambush on ambush. They were waiting for that group of Polizei, which will replace the one that had been in the forest since morning. The operation was carried out in full accordance with the plan. When the Polizei came out of the village, the scouts let them pass by themselves, and then after waiting for some time and leaving a barrier of 5 men armed with handheld machine guns and automatic rifles, moved towards the enemy garrison. They marched, not strictly observing the order of the formation, openly talking loudly. In the thickening darkness it was difficult to understand who was coming. That was what they had counted on when working out the plan. When the group was about 200 meters from the village, a sentry shouted, "Stop, who is coming?" Without thinking and without stopping the formation, Maltsev shouted back, "Their own, change." The sentry calmed down. However, when the scouts approached him 50 meters, he again raised his voice. "Stop, password." Partisans did not know the password. Maltsev, however, was not confused. He loudly gave the group a command to stop and himself, with a decisive step, went to the sentry, standing at the last hut next to the machine gun. Apparently, the confidence and swagger of the leader of the group left no doubt in the policeman's mind that they were really their own. He calmly watched as Maltsev approached, and when he suddenly snatched a dagger, he did not even have time to shriek. Taking the machine gun and leaving 2 men to cover, the scouts in formation, without disguise, entered the village. 2 patrolmen and a sentry at the opposite end of the village were removed just as silently. Electric flashlights flashed. Klimov's detachment entered the Morozi silently. It was completely dark outside. Lights were burning only in a few houses. Partisans took the positions indicated to each in advance. A few more moments, and grenades flew into the windows, rumbled muffled explosions, and then heard sharp machine gun bursts. Few of the garrison managed to escape. The trophies that the guerrillas got in this battle could barely fit on 10 sled wagons captured here. It was weapons, ammunition, food, clothes and shoes, other property. In addition to the 10 horses pulling the sleighs, 20 more were captured. It was a real convoy, the arrival of which was greeted with great joy in the regiment. By the way, I want to say a few words about the partisan trophies separately. Reading the description of our military life in fiction, I noticed that other authors seem to compete with each other in an effort to impress the reader with numbers. When it comes to trophies, they are often dozens, and more often hundreds of rifles, automatic rifles, and machine guns. Well, this also happened, but not every time. Capturing trophies are great labor and great luck. We rejoiced at every machine gun, every rifle, every pistol captured in battle, and in fiction there are many digits. But this does not enrich, but only confuses and even in a sense impoverishes the real picture. If we really could capture such trophies, would it have appeared in the documents of the operative group of the Elchspeed on the northwestern front in January 1943? The total number of newly created detachments reaches 1,500 people. The created partisan detachments are not yet active because of the lack of arms and ammunition. Flip through the collection of documents The Unconquered Land of Pskov, and you will find much more scrupulous documents, and you will find much more modest figures than in fiction. However, they do not become less significant. In light of this, the trophies captured in Morozi were quite large. In addition to 30 horses, 2 machine guns, 80 rifles, 10 automatic rifles, ammunition and other things. 5 days later, the fate of the defeated enemy garrison was shared by 2 others, in the villages of Gorushki and Ristsovo. The Hitlerite detachment, standing in the village of Pogorelka, withdrew from the place and left to Slavkovichi. There was no more enemy in the nearest district. All this could not but infuriate the occupants. They made an attempt to destroy the regiment. On February 9, over 500 Punishers were thrown into the area of Sevo. The regiment gave battle, and then at night by a swift rush left 30 kilometers away to the village Vladimirets. About what happened next, better than me will tell the document. Act on the atrocities of the fascist punitive detachment in the village of Sevo, Navareshki Village Council, Pozerevitsky District, Leningrad Region, February 16, 1943. Done in the presence of Alexander Ivanov, Vasily Karivich Yakushev, Citizen M, from the village of Sevo, Navareshki Village Council, Pozerevitsky District. On February 10, 1943, a German punitive detachment broke into the village of Sevo, Navareshki Village Council, Pozerevitsky District, Leningrad Region, and immediately began to massacre the peaceful population. Hitler's executioners burned 16 houses out of 17 with all outbuildings. All property of collective farmers perished in the fire. The Punishers shot civilians who tried to leave the burning houses at point-blank range, regardless of their sex or age, or threw them alive into the fire. As a result of this savage massacre, 86 civilians were killed and burned, including 78 from the village of Sevo and 8 from other villages. Of the dead, 61 were shot and 25 were burned alive. There were 14 men, 27 women, 45 children between the ages of 8 months and 15 years. 19 people escaped from the massacre, who managed to get out of the village under cover of smoke from the burning buildings. I was only in Sevo for a few days, the worst since I was wounded. My leg ached insanely, and I spent most of the time lying in one of the huts. I don't remember how the landlady and her children were brought in. I didn't even remember their faces. They were blurred like in a fog, and yet the news of the tragedy that played out there echoed with pain in my heart. After all, it was for us, partisans, unarmed and defenseless people died. They gave us shelter, warmed us, fed us, took care of the wounded. They took care of me. And then enemy soldiers broke into the village. How could soldiers be executioners? I wanted to fight. I wanted to shoot at these scoundrels, for whom the worst punishment is too mild, but it was impossible. They wouldn't let me out of the hospital. They said it wasn't time yet, that it was necessary to recover from the wound. A few days later, I was sent on leave. I left for Perm, where at that time my family was evacuated. I had not seen my wife and daughters for almost 2 years, and it was a joy to meet them. When I returned to Valdai, another joy awaited me. I was awarded 2 government awards, the Order of the Great Patriotic War to a degree, and the Medal for the Defense of Leningrad. During these days, I was depressed by one thing, the limp that would not go away. The damaged tendon was still painful. I had to develop mobility of the foot with special gymnastic exercises every day for a long time, and still walked as before, leaning on a stick. Tempole received an assignment, temporarily until the final cure, was included in the task force of the LSHD on the northwestern front. I did not know at that time that the word temporarily did not mean that I would be sent to the enemy rear. I did not know that my military fate was again expected to take a sharp turn. I worked with the constant thought of soon returning to my regiment, closely following its affairs. The regiment was still operating in the area where I had left it, the 3rd Brigade of AV. Hermann also came out here, this area, which was in the rear of Hitler's 16th Army. Despite all the difficulties, was extremely favourable for guerrilla AC. Here were the most important communications of Army Group North, sabotage on which disrupted the delivery of military supplies. In addition, the area controlled by the guerrillas directly adjacent to Skov, where was the headquarters of Army Group North. This allowed to send saboteurs there, occasionally alarming the very top of the command of the enemy troop. All this could not, of course, not cause a response, and in May 1943, the Nazis organized a large punitive expedition which had the task to destroy the partisans and completely secure a strategically important area. The expedition involved up to 12,000 soldiers and officers, aviation, artillery. During 2 almost months, starting from May 11, 1943, the regiment practically did not leave the battles. During the day, having taken advantageous defensive positions, the guerrillas entered into a fight with the Punishers, and with the onset of darkness a rapid rush went 30 kilometers away and occupied a new area of defense, preparing. When they succeeded, they took the cargo dropped from airplanes on parachutes, ammunition. There was a shortage of them almost always, and continuously sent groups of saboteurs to the railroad lines. The main task in these days remained unchanged. 15 heavy battles endured the regiment in May and June. A major battle every 4 days. This, believe me, for partisans is extremely difficult. Hitlerites lost in these battles over 550 soldiers and officers, 16 vehicles, several tanks and artillery pieces. Besides, 1 township government was defeated, 5 military echelons were put under the sledge, and the regiment grew in numbers. This did not mean, of course, that it had no losses. They were, and very heavy, but the influx of volunteers covered these losses more than enough. Hitlerites strove to suppress any resistance in their rear, but achieved the exact opposite result. It was during this period on the territory of the Leningrad region, captured by the occupants, was the maturation of the people's armed uprising, which, bursting out a few months later, radically changed the situation, finally paralyzed the entire rear of Army Group North, and the signs that soon the entire population of the occupied territories will be actively involved in the fight against the invaders could be seen by analysing almost any report from the brigades. More and more often the occupation authorities were confronted with mass sabotage of planned measures. Railway stations, industrial enterprises, workshops became centres of active resistance to any undertakings of the Nazis, and often sabotage turned into sabotage. The Pskov railroad junction, for example, through which the bulk of cargoes for the army group set, became a place of such strong resistance of the Soviet people working there that the occupiers had to replace all Russian workers of the track and traffic service, from switches to drivers, with their military railroaders, and soon they had to take the same measures in Donovsky, Batetsky, Luzovsky and other railroad junctions and large stations. Having started in cities, workers' settlements and railway stations, the mass movement against the occupiers spread to rural areas, especially the western, central and southwestern regions, which later became the centres of the uprising. In order to procure agricultural products, to attract the population to work, to recruit labour force to be sent to Germany, the Nazis sent to the villages no longer separate economic teams, but entire expeditions including military units, and some. In July I met Hermann again. He had flown to Valdai from Leningrad, where he had been summoned to clarify the tasks assigned to the brigade during that period, and was now preparing to return to the enemy rear. I was very happy about this meeting. Alexander Viktorovich told me in detail about everything that was happening in those days in the southern parts of the region, about the peculiarities of the situation there, about the tactics and methods of struggle used by the partisans. By this time, the 3rd Brigade had become the recognized leader of the partisan movement in the Leningrad region. It acted confidently, boldly, effectively, and therefore everything that Hermann talked about was extremely interesting. In addition, he was well aware of the affairs of my regiment, told me in detail about the lives of my comrades in arms, whom I had not seen for 6 months. Alexander Viktorovich was cheerful, energetic. He was eager to join the brigade, and was very annoyed at the circumstances that forced him to delay in Valdai. Soon, however, his departure was scheduled. We arranged a send-off. We stayed late at Gordon's apartment. It was fun and a little sad, but all in all it was good. That's when I gave Hermann a trophy Mauser. What else could we give each other in the war? He left for the airfield. And none of us who saw him off never saw him alive again. There were less than 2 months left till the last Battle of Kombrigg. July 20, 1943 was the last turn in my military fate. I received an order from M. Nikitin to leave for Kafornaya and to begin to fulfill the duties of Deputy Chief of the Operative Group of the SPD on the Volkhov Front. To send Pankrati Romanovich Shevardaukan, who worked in this position, was being recalled to Leningrad to work in the apparatus of the regional committee of the party, and I had to urgently take over his affairs. The head of the Auschwitz operative group on the Volkhov front was Andrei Alexeyevich Guzayev. I had heard this name many times, but for some reason I did not realize that they were talking about the very Guzayev, whom I knew well before the Finnish War, when I worked together in the office of the Leningrad Committee for Physical Culture and Sports. He was then head of the Personnel Department, and I was head of the Department of Educational Institutions. After the Finnish War, Andrei Alexeyevich became an instructor of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and from the beginning of the Great Patriotic War he worked in the Leningrad headquarters of the partisan movement. In October 1941, he headed the newly created operative group at the military councils of the armies of the Leningrad Front, operating outside the siege ring, and later, with the creation of the Volkhov Front, became head of the Volkhov operative group. Waiting for the arrival of his new deputy, he, like me, did not expect to see a long familiar person. He knew that Afanasyev, the former commander of the partisan regiment, was coming to see him, and that was all. Thus our meeting, for all its plannedness, was also unexpected. We both rejoiced at the circumstances that had brought us together, although we were not very surprised by them. The war not only scattered people around the world, there were amazing meetings, sometimes even with those who you never thought to see, and we got used to that too. I began to familiarize myself with things, with my new comrades, with a new place. Kvoninskaya partisan base, its solidity, thoroughness, and excellent material security impressed immediately. In 2-3 kilometers from the village, in a dry pine forest, not far from the River Pease, located a large camp with good dugouts, dining room, storage facilities and several houses well camouflaged from observation from the air. A kilometre from the base was a field airfield. It had a multi-purpose purpose and served not only the partisans. Here, for example, made an intermediate landing for airplanes flying from Moscow to Leningrad or from Leningrad to Leningrad, now to Leningrad or from Leningrad to Moscow. But the masters of the airfield were considered our partisan pilots from the air regiment commanded by Nikolai Antonovich Gritsenko. In close proximity to the front line, 40 kilometers northeast of the German-occupied Novgorod, in the village of Alexandrovskoye was located an intermediate base, which also had a field airfield. It was headed by an experienced partisan, former commander of the Vsevolozhsk detachment Dmitry Ivanovich Vlasov. At the airfield were based light aircraft U-2 and P-5, which were part of the regiment Gritsenko. In short, the economy of the Volkhov task force was large. On the territory of the base, among other things, there was even an artist's workshop. Professionals who had gone to partisans during the war and now had the opportunity to return to their work worked here. Alexander Alexandrovich Blinkov, Timofey Timofeyevich Shevchenko, Luka Nikolaevich Barbash, familiar to me from the partisan region, worked here with brush and chisel, already now caring that at future exhibitions, dedicated to the anniversaries of the victory over Hitler's fascism, among other sculptures and paintings, people could see works dedicated to the Leningrad partisans. The workshop was, however, quite unusual, a huge dugout, the roof of which served as greenhouse frames. But in those days, people were happy with such a construction. The artists worked from morning till night. They were fun and interesting. The ill-speed operative groups were not only engaged in guiding and supplying partisan units, fighting on the sections of their fronts. They helped in the work of underground inter-district party centers, coordinated their joint actions with the guerrillas. Inter-district centers were created by the decision of the Bureau of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party on October 8, 1942. In the course of the war, the Regional Party Committee was constantly improving the forms and methods of underground party work in the enemy rear. The creation of inter-district centers was another step on this path. Already in the fall of 1942, in connection with the intensification of the people's struggle in the enemy-occupied territory of the region, the urgent need for a significant strengthening of party work in the areas captured by the Nazis became obvious. Behind the still scattered and unorganized opposition of the population to the fascist regime, the contours of the future popular uprising were guessed. However, it was quite obvious that its success would depend entirely on the organization and unity of action of all those who would participate in the struggle. In other words, the imminent uprising needed a leader. In the summer of 1942, a network of district party groups was created in the territory of the Leningrad region occupied by the Nazis. But the enemy managed to inflict on these groups a series of cruel blows. By the fall, the majority of their participants either died or lost contact with the regional committee. That's when it was decided to create inter-district party centers. By the spring of 1943, by the decision of the Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of the People's Commissariat of Communism, 11 centers were thrown into the rear of the enemy. Piaskov-Sovsky, Govsky, Strugokrasnensky, Porkovsky, Didovichi, Doksky, Lushky, Novgorodsky and Kingisepsky. Empowered with the authority of representatives of the Regional Party Committee, having experienced personnel and much more material resources than the district party groups, the centers confidently took over the leadership of the people's struggle in the enemy rear. They organized underground cells, conducted propaganda and agitation among the population, organized sabotage of political and economic activities of the Nazis, created reserves to replenish the ranks of partisans, and formed new detachments, organized sabotage groups, introduced their own people to serve in the local government, destroyed traitors and traitors, created bases of food and uniforms for the partisans. Fundamentally new tasks before the centers were not set, wrote the head of the Lushino Center I. They had to do what was done in the past underground district committees. An important role was assigned to the activation of the struggle of the population with Hitler's army and occupation authorities, not to give the fascists grain, to disrupt logging, road and defense works, to spoil machines and raw materials at enterprises, to destroy fascist generals and major officials. To work behind enemy lines, the inter-district centers had everything they needed: radio stations, portable Lilliput printing presses suitable for printing not only leaflets, but also newspapers, sabotage equipment, good weapons and equipment, and this fact already gives an idea of their activity. The number of newspapers and leaflets published behind enemy lines increased at that time several times. The newspapers Kovsky Kolkoznik, Novoselskaya Pravda, Way of Socialism, Zvezda Kolkoznya Zhitin, Kolkoznaya Stroitelka Kresny Partisan, Partisan Revenge, Patriot of the Motherland, Narodny Avenger, and many others appeared regularly in villages and hamlets, in cities and working towns of the region. The creation of inter-district party centres was not, however, the ultimate goal of the organisational activities of the regional committee. It was only a preparatory step toward the restoration of the district party organs, which later led the armed popular uprising in their district. I began my work in the Volkov operative group at a difficult time. Despite the reduced concentration of Hitler's troops in the Leningrad region due to the events at Stalingrad, Kursk, Bulge, and other fronts, the command of Army Group still threw a significant amount of forces against the guerrillas. More than 40,000 soldiers and officers of the field gendarmerie and regular units recalled from the front participated in the punitive actions, which began in May and continued until now, against the 2nd Partisan Brigade named after H.G. Vasiliev. Troops totaling up to 20,000 men were moved. 12,000 Punishers fought with the 3rd, 4th Brigades and the 1st Separate Regiment. Hitlerreich's superiority in manpower was tenfold. Such visification of inter-district party centres was also difficult. In a report to the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of the Soviet Union, N. Nikitin on July 1, 1943, it should be noted that the party centres have to work in the most difficult conditions. Numerous punitive detachments operate in the districts, due to which comrades are forced to live in the forests, observing the strictest secrecy, and often to engage in combat with the suffering losses. During the period from January to June 1, 1943, several comrades were killed in the fight against the invaders. Killed Secretary of the Lyadsky R.C. Viktor Fedotov, the Secretary of the Pozerovensky R.C. of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks or Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, Onkadros, Tove, Karpov, the Chairman of the Lyadsky Executive Committee of the District Council, Tekleistov, the Secretary of the Komsomol R.C. Tov, Semyonov, and yet the underground centres did not reduce the activity of their work. M.A. Nikitin concludes the quoted note with the conclusion, "The creation of underground inter-district party centres has justified itself." The Gidov, Strogokrasnensky, Luzhevsky, Orodeshky, Novgorod and Kingisepp centres operated in the territory controlled by the Volkov operative group. It should be noted that until August 1943, the partisan struggle was particularly active in the strip of the Northwestern Front. It was here that the partisan region was located, the arena of the most intense struggle in the occupied territory of the Leningrad region in the first period of the war. Here operated the 2nd LPB, which played such a prominent role in the fight against the German invaders. Since 1943, the most active partisan unit was the 3rd Brigade of AV German, but it, as well as the 2nd Brigade, fought south of the railroad Pskov, Staraya Russa. North of this highway to deploy partisan action on the same scale for a long time could not succeed. It is clear that the closer to Leningrad, the higher was the concentration of enemy troops, and this greatly complicated the guerrilla struggle. Time, however, required the expansion of the boundaries of active partisan action. I have already written that in the summer of 1942, the Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of the Soviet Union set the task of turning the entire occupied territory of the Leningrad region, in fact, in a continuous partisan region. This decision, despite any punitive measures of the Nazis, was not cancelled. On the contrary, by the middle of 1943, it required the earliest realization in connection with the emergence of a popular armed uprising in the enemy's rear. The Leningrad headquarters of the partisan movement, without weakening the actions in the southern regions, continued to move units of the People's Avengers to the north. In February, based on the detachments of I Grozny and AP Estov, was reconstituted 5th LPB, whose commander was Konstantin Dionysievich Karitsky, who had fought in the partisan region at the head of a battalion of the 1st Brigade, and Commissar Ivanovich Sergud. Both of them were cadre military men. Both had a lot of partisan experience. The brigade grew rapidly. At the end of April, with a strength of about 600 people, It began to relocate from the Pozerevitsky district to the Strugokrasnensky district, closer to Leningrad. In June, it was already active in the areas defined by the Leningrad headquarters and covering the Luzhsky, Plusky, Daedsky, Porkovsky, Soletsky, Utogoshky, and Batitsky districts of the region. In April, the guerrillas of the 2nd Ng Vasiliev Brigade started fighting in Lyadsky, Slantsev, Osminsky, Strugokrasnensky, and Ponovsky districts. The strength of the 2nd LPB at that time was 850 men. And at the end of March, in the area of Lake Chernoi airplanes were transferred newly created 11th Partisan Brigade. Its commander was appointed Alexei Petrovich Luchin, former secretary of the Starorusky District Party Committee, and Commissar Fedor Ivanovich Sezanov, also a party worker, former before the war, the secretary of the Oredeshki Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party. In the spring of 1943, the brigade consisted of 9 detachments totaling 528 men. It was to be based in the Oredeshki district, to operate in the adjacent areas Krasnogvardesky, Tosnensky, Luga, Novgorod, and in the sphere of control of partisans fell dense network of enemy communication. Warsaw Road, Kiev Highway, roads Leningrad, Novgorod, Leningrad, Batetsk, Luga, Batetskaya, Novgorod. Closer to Leningrad than the 11th, since the beginning of the war, no partisan brigade has been located. However, let the reader not get the impression that the redeployment was easy. The German rear was at this time agitated by the actions of partisans to an unprecedented degree. The German command sent against them one punitive expedition after another, and the balance of power was always in favor of the occupiers. So the example of the 5th Brigade eloquently testifies to the difficulties that our men had to overcome in these days. During the transition to a new area, it lost almost a third of its strength. In June, only 337 men remained in its ranks. On the close approaches to Leningrad, north of the Pskov-Staraya Russa railroad, it was possible to concentrate significant partisan forces. At the same time, the number of brigades was now constantly and rapidly growing. During the summer and fall, the number of fighters in the same 5th Brigade, for example, increased to 7,000 people. The place of active partisan actions became almost the entire occupied part of the region. The center of the guerrilla movement began to move towards Leningrad. Just a few days after arriving in Kovoynaya, I found myself alone. Guseyev flew to the 11th Brigade. By this time, the leaders of the Leningrad partisan headquarters had formed an opinion about the fallacy of the tactics adopted in this brigade. The effectiveness of its combat operations remained much lower than expected. Guseyev was to conduct an inspection, the results of which were to be discussed at a special meeting at the Leningrad headquarters dedicated to the 11th LPB. It was expected that this business trip would last a few days, but circumstances changed dramatically. Under enemy attacks, the brigade began to raid, and Guseyev was stuck in the enemy rear for almost 2 months. And I found myself in the position of a man who has to learn to swim in a deep place. My loneliness was, of course, relative. Nearby worked experienced, knowledgeable people. To get used to the new position helped, and quite frequent visits to Kovoynaya operational workers Eleshbid. I remember that at that time we often had the secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, the head of the Leningrad partisan headquarters Mikhail Nikitich Nikitin, his deputy for operational work Mikhail Fedorovich Alexeyev, the head of the radio department Alexander Mikhailovich Shatunov. It was always possible to consult. It was always possible to count on the help and support of the chief of Kiev-Kiveninsky base, Nikolai Alexandrovich Sukhov. I can't help but remember with kind word and pilots of partisan air regiment, their commander Nikolai Antonovich Gritsenko, deputy commander Viktor Pavlovich Legostin, chief of staff Yakov Grigorievich Zhigalev, pilots Mikhail Mikhailovich Lobankov, Vladimir Vasilievich Sirotin, Vasily Mikhailovich Alexandrov, responsible for parachute service Grigory Antonovich Tolyarchik. By the nature of my new duties, I had to maintain constant communication with the Volkhov front headquarters. Here I met the front commander Kirill Afanasievich Meretskov and a member of the military council, the secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Fomich. Both of them did a lot for the partisans. Both of them treated us extremely seriously and interested. It is clear that the care of the partisans was not the main thing for the front headquarters, and yet we could not complain about the lack of attention. Our requests, as a rule, were quickly satisfied. If there was a need, our problems were also discussed at the Military Council of the Front, the Sieg-und-Wirt. The combat actions of the partisans were successfully combined with the strikes of the Volkov Front troops. Already after the war in his memoirs In the Service of the People K.A., Meretskov wrote, "I believe that historians will pay special attention to this interaction between the guerrillas and the Red Army troops. This feature of the guerrilla movement during the Great Patriotic War really could not go unnoticed. Historians note it as one of the most important." The words of the former Wehrmacht General L. Frendulich testify to what the representatives of the command of Hitler's troops thought in this regard. The centralized leadership of the detachments was obvious, because in the preparation and conduct of any significant offensive, German or Russian troops' partisans immediately intensified their actions to disorganize the supply and disrupt communication between the parts of the German army, said the capture and liquidation of ammunition depots and attacks on the cantonment of troops. These actions became a heavy burden on the army and posed considerable danger. In no other theatre of war was not such a close interaction between the guerrillas and the regular army. The main concern of the operative groups at the end of July was the preparation for the Operation Rail War developed by the central headquarters of the guerrilla movement. This was one of the largest partisan actions, in which Leningrad, Belarusian, Kalinin, Smolensk, Ural and Ukrainian partisans were to take part simultaneously. Subsequently, the partisans of the Baltics were also included in it. On the huge territory, stretching for 1,000 kilometers along the front and 750 kilometers deep into the rear of the enemy troops, the units of the People's Avengers were to go to the railroads, seize many kilometers of track, and destroy them as far as possible. The name Rail War emphasized the essential difference of the operation from the previously conducted sabotage, if up to now their object was, as a rule, enemy echelons. Now the railroad track itself, every rail on it was attacked, not individual small sabotage groups, but all practically partisan forces stationed near the railroads were to be involved. The length of each rail is 12.5 meters. It is not difficult to calculate that every 80 rails is a kilometer. Having broken each rail into 2 or 3 parts by explosions of special toka balls, the partisans had to turn the railroad track into a dump of scrap metal, completely unsuitable for restoration. Stavka of the Supreme Command of the Soviet troops linked the Operation Rail War with its plans to complete the defeat of the Nazis in the Battle of Kursk, the Smolensk operation and the liberation of the left bank Ukraine. Inka Voynaya held a meeting, to which were summoned the commanders of brigades, regiments, and separately operating detachments. Mikhail Nikitin, who had flown in from Leningrad especially for this purpose, held it. The secretary of the Leningrad Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party, who headed the regional headquarters of the partisan movement, was known not only to the partisans, but also to many residents of the occupied district. Among those who fought behind enemy lines, the name of Nikitin was very popular. I also heard a lot about Mikhail Nikitich, but I saw him now for the first time. Later, both during the war and after it, I had to meet with Nikitin quite often, and at one time I had to work under his direct supervision. I have the kindest memories of him. Despite the high post he held, Mikhail Nikitich always kept surprisingly simple, quickly created around him an atmosphere of uninhibited free communication. He was a very benevolent person, quickly disposed to himself. It was easy to talk to him directly, frankly, truthfully, but otherwise it simply did not work. Shyness and uncertainty of the interlocutor, who spoke with Nikitin for the first time, very quickly and seemed to disappear by itself. But never Mikhail Nikitich did not flirt with people, never and never adjusted to anyone. Those of his qualities, which I have just written about, did not prevent him from being a man of will, decisive, firm, and sometimes even tough. He never refused to discuss a decision with all concerned before making it. However, when the decision was already made, he did not allow any talk and demanded the most precise execution. It was from him that I first heard the words that a person who wants to work always finds a way to realize what he has planned, and a person who does not want to work always finds a reason to cite later. The meeting lasted until late in the evening. We defined the tasks of each of the units. The areas of their actions named the time of the beginning of the operation, the night of July 31 to August 1. We discussed tactics and methods of combat operations, issues of material support, agreed on communication. The assigned task became clear in all details. The same night, the commanders were transferred by airplanes to their formations and units. The final stage of training began. The training of all partisans in the use of explosives was completed, especially for the rail warfare-made toka balls, which had the shape of a hen's egg, convenient for transportation, and had sufficient explosive power. In brigades, regiments, and detachments, the smallest details of the operation were specified. Its scale required the utmost precision coherence of actions of all, even the smallest group. Huge work carried out in these days partisan aviation. In the rear of the enemy was transferred a huge amount of cargo: explosives, Bickford cord, fuses, weapons, ammunition. Pilots of the regiment Gritsenko, workers of bases in Kifoynaya and in Alexandrovskaya did not know peace. Each airplane made several sorties during the night to check whether there are no flaws in the carefully developed plan of the operation, which could affect the success of the case. The headquarters of the guerrilla movement decided to hold on the night of July 24-25 a kind of dress rehearsal. The 1st Independent Regiment was instructed to make a test strike. The operation involved 4 detachments of the regiment. Having secretly concentrated in the specified area, they deployed a 3-kilometer front, seized a section of the railroad between Ostrov and Pskov near the village of Stremutka, and exactly at the appointed time began to blow up the roadbed. As a result, the entire 3-kilometer section of track was destroyed. Not a single intact rail was left on both tracks. Besides, the bridge was destroyed. More than 2 kilometers of telegraph-telephone communication was destroyed. 50 Hitlerites were killed. This raid confirmed the correctness of the developed plan, and the experience gained in the course of the raid was used by the headquarters in preparation for the operation. And here came July 31, 1943. On the first night, 3 brigades operating in the Volkhov front strip put out of operation 1032 rails. On the Vitebsk road between the stations Kolovo and Torkovichi, the detachments of the 11th Brigade blew up 436 rails. Near the station Plusa of the Warsaw Railroad, the detachments of the 5th Brigade destroyed 286 rails, and detachments of the 2nd Brigade near Zarichi blew up a bridge and 3 tendrails. It should be said that the first massive strike on railroads Leningrad partisans struck after the Oral partisans, and a few days earlier than the main forces that took part in the rail war. On the territory of other regions, this operation began on the night of August 3-4. By this time, the strength of the strikes on enemy communications near Leningrad had increased considerably. The rail war became not a short-term campaign, but a permanent form of struggle with the enemy. Diversions were organized not only by partisan units, but also by inter-district underground parties. For example, the Kingisepp Center conducted a series of strikes on the Baltic Road, which the Nazis considered calm, and the Pskov Center. On the road Pskov-Wyman, south of the zone of action of the 2nd LPB, despite all the measures, the Nazis could not secure their railway communications. One of the sabotage of the rail war I had an opportunity to observe from the air. On a cloudy autumn night, I flew on a business trip to the enemy rear. I was to spend a few days in the brigade of K.D. Karitsky. Code was suspended on a string in a cellar, cold, damp, and absolutely dark. The stars and the moon were hidden by dense clouds, but on the ground the light was always carefully masked. We were flying at about 1 kilometer altitude, and soon we should be approaching the landing place. I began to look down to see the light signal. Suddenly there was a bright explosion on the ground ahead and to the right on the course, which seemed to pull a whole ribbon of others of the same kind. This ribbon stretched in an instant for 2 or 3 kilometers and remotely resembled a flashing Christmas tree garland, the lights of which, although they flashed rather randomly, nevertheless drew a strictly defined outline. It remained, maybe, for a minute, and then the ribbon, pulsating with tiny dots of explosions, began to break into pieces, which in their turn were also broken, fading away, and soon there was impenetrable darkness under us again. When the plane landed, I learned that I had seen the sabotage carried out on the Vitebsk road by AAF Tarakanov's regiment from the 5th LPB. The scale of the rail war near Leningrad is shown by such figures. In August, partisans blew up more than 11,000 rails, destroyed 20 railway bridges, 34 kilometers of telegraph-telephone communication, derailed 21 enemy giant traffic jams were formed at the stations. The echelons, waiting for the restoration of the way, became a perfect target for the strikes of our aviation. At the end of the month in Pskov, for example, 50 trains stuck at the station were subjected to air attack. Meanwhile, the battle on the rails was still heating up. By mid-November, the total number of rails destroyed by the Leningrad partisans exceeded 52.5 thousand. This means that the total length of more than 650 kilometers was put out of operation. In the first days of November, partisans intercepted, near the village of Zryashaya Gora Karamishevsky district, a large batch of letters of Hitler's soldiers to their relatives and acquaintances. Part of these letters was published in December by the partisan newspaper for the Soviet motherland. Almost each of them contains a mention of sabotage on the railroad. I think that the reader will be interested to know how the rail war was perceived by those against whom it was waged. Staff Sergeant Joseph Muller to his fiancée Anna Gray. Here I have been sitting in a foreign unit for 3 days now, more than 100 kilometers away from my unit. I would very much like to return by train, but unfortunately the journey has been interrupted, for the Russians are blowing up the rails every night. Staff Sergeant Rupert Coe to his fiancée. Yesterday the partisans made an attack not far from us. They blew up a train with vacationers and then got into a fight. You can imagine what was left after that. You don't feel safe even when you go to the restroom. There's nowhere to pass or go. These guerrillas are very close. Forces number in the thousands. Staff Sergeant Kurt Langer to his wife Ini Langer. Yesterday the Russians again attacked the train with vacationers, with heavy fighting, and of course not without casualties. Now, it is not very pleasant to go on vacation, for only a few get to the border of the state in good health. Ernst Trainer to his wife. You must sometimes receive mail from me irregularly, for the partisans blow up the rails in many places, so that sometimes for 2 or 3 days there is no railroad communication. And as a summary, the words addressed to Walter Thornebrook by his father son. Says the withdrawal of our troops is ultimately due to the actions of the partisans. The extent of their operations can be imagined from conversations with men who participated in their suppression. Recently, one of the military men who lives in our neighborhood was here. He was wounded during one of these operations, so he describes it as a second front in the rear of the main defense line. At the end of August, Nikitin summoned me to Leningrad, as it turned out already on the spot, to receive instructions and participate in the development of documents relating to the continuation of the rail war. Mikhail Nikitich introduced me to the general plan, which looked very schematic. My task was to work together with the operational staff of the headquarters, if possible, to detail this plan in that part of it, which concerned the actions in the Volkhov front. I flew to Leningrad at night, and a draft of the project was to be submitted to Nikitin in the morning. The next day was allotted for finalizing the document, and in the evening, on the way back to Kavoynaya. There was a lot of work, so I had almost no free time left. Still, I managed to wander briefly around the city, which I had been waiting to meet for more than 2 years, to visit acquaintances. It had changed terribly. Our Leningrad, houses destroyed by countless bombings and artillery raids, deserted streets. There is no point in writing about all this in detail. I will hardly be able to add anything substantial to the picture of the tragedy and feat of the blockaded Leningrad already created by eyewitness accounts, the work of writers, artists, playwrights, cinematographers. I saw not much, but this is more than enough for me until the present day, enough until my death. Tense rhythm of work of Korfuninskaya and Alexandrovskaya bases, established during the period of preparation for the rail war, remained in the future. The endless stream of cargoes went through the front line. Their number not only did not decrease, but steadily increased. Our brigades were growing rapidly. They needed more and more weapons, more and more ammunition. Aviation Regiment Gritsenko, working already at the last limit of its capabilities, was unable to fully ensure the supply of guerrillas. The lack of airplanes was felt more and more acutely every day, and finally we were forced to appeal for help to the Military Council of the Front. The task force asked for and received several military transport planes with crews at its disposal. It became a little easier, but still the needs of the brigades in connection with the transition of the war behind enemy lines to a new phase grew much faster than our capabilities. Airplanes delivered not only cargoes to the enemy rear. No less often they transported partisans who came out of hospitals and returned to their units. Often the conditions did not allow the planes to land, and then we had to hastily teach people the simplest methods of handling a parachute. Even the shortest parachute training course is hard to call it now. In the morning, a group of partisans came to the airfield, many of whom had never before seen not only a parachute, but even an airplane, and by the evening they were businessfully placed in the passenger compartment of the transport car, which took them to the place of drop, and the first jump in their lives they had to make in no way in the order of training. I have never ceased to be amazed at the miracles that were made fanatically in love with his work. The head of the Parachute and Airborne Service, Grigory Antonovich Tulyakik. The smallness of the time allotted to him to prepare people for jumps was quite obvious, and yet I do not remember a single case of unsuccessful landing. All of his students surprisingly quickly and invariably successfully mastered the parachute and flew into the enemy rear, without any doubt in the sufficiency of their training. Through the hands of Tulyakik, past regimental commanders F.S. Skerodumov and N. A.A. Volobuev, squad leaders V.D. Shaposhnikov, B.I., Irene Prez, and many, many others. And after all, Grigory Antonovich had to have time to still prepare for dropping on parachutes all the cargo sent to the brigades. However, he had time to do everything and never complained about the lack of time. In general, about our partisan pilots could tell a lot of interesting things, and I am very sorry that in the military literature their life has not yet found a worthy reflection. It was no less bright, no less heroic than the lives of pilots of other branches of military aviation. If we talk about what their combat work meant for everyone who fought in the enemy rear, you cannot be afraid to fall into the extreme. It is simply impossible to overestimate the fact of the existence of an air bridge, firmly linking the guerrillas with the Soviet rear. I have already written about the fact that airplanes delivered to us and weapons and ammunition and food and uniforms. I wrote how much it meant to be able to receive mail, fresh Soviet newspapers, letters from relatives surrounded by the enemy. We did not feel cut off from the motherland, and that was the most important thing. And how many partisans owed their lives to the pilots. After all, until it was possible to send our wounded to the Soviet rear, how many people died not even from the average severity of paradise, but in the fall of 1941, the pilot of the 3rd Air Regimenter, Zir Shelest, was the first to land his plane on the prepared by partisans ground, and other pilots followed him, first in the partisan region, then in all districts of the region. I myself witnessed how the Chief of Staff of the 4th Air Regimenter, Zhigalev, pilots NV, Alexeyev and others, literally from under the noses of the Punishers, took out in the summer of 1943 from the 11th Brigade more than 70 wounded. A little earlier, the same number of wounded were evacuated from the 5th Brigade, and the weather in those days was not favourable. But everyone involved in this operation made several sorties to the enemy rear during the night. The last planes returned to the base at dawn. In January 1944, from the same 5th Brigade, pilots evacuated 105 wounded during the night. This is a feat, without any exaggeration. I knew many pilots of the 3rd and 4th Air Regiments. I can't help but talk about them with the deepest respect, with the deepest gratitude. E.A. G. Zhigalev, M.A. Nikiforov, M. Mikiforov, M. Lobankov, S.N. Rybakov, M. Alexandrov, V.V. Sirotin, N.V.E. Alexeyev, A.I. Perederi, I.D. Cherkashin, I. Sinitsyn, I. Ryshkov, E.E.I. Reit, Inkin Sokolov, B.I. and their comrades in arms knew and loved. They were obliged to them. They were rejoiced in every detachment. I cannot help but tell more about Yakov Grigorievich Zhigalev. He was the Chief of Staff of the regiment. He flew no less than others, and often in the thick of it, preferring to risk himself rather than his subordinates. So he was an invalid. In 1933, being a pilot instructor, had an accident and lost his left leg. He had to give up flying, of course. But when the war began, he won the right to join the ranks, and fought until victory. Among his combat awards are 3 Orders of the Red Banner. Zhigalev walked with a noticeable limp, but did not feel any disadvantage, and over his prosthesis only laughed. Here, for example, as he told about one of his combat sorties in the winter of the 42nd year, he flew then on the U-2, which had no armor protection, as you know, and came under heavy enemy fire. Imagine how it would hit nearby. The whole cabin was shredded, the instruments were shattered, and a couple of splinters. In the prosthesis, only shreds flew. Now looks. If I'd had my own leg, I'd have been hospitalized, or even worse. You might not have made it, but that's just fine. He came back, unbuckled his prosthesis and repaired it. No surgeries, no bandages. He didn't tell the story to the end, though. probably because the end was not so cheerful. Jetting come out from under fire, he was pulling the shattered car to the front line, and here he was shelled again. This time there was no luck. Shrapnel hit his right leg, arm and face. The airplane ceased to obey, fell into the forest. But Zhigailev still got to some of our unit. From there he was taken to the hospital, was released, and he was back in the ranks. Interesting was the fate of the youngest of the commanders of Heavy, at that time transport aircraft Li-2 Vladimir Vasilievich Sirotin. He still lives in Leningrad. After the war he became a pilot of Aeroflot and was awarded the title Honored Pilot of the USE. In May 1943, Sirotin flew on the U-2. During one of the flights to the enemy rear was shot down, but managed to soften the blow during the fall and survived. The crash site of his machine was noticed by the pilot of another U-2 airplane flying on the same mission, Gvozdev. Having landed at the partisan airfield, Gvozdev took the wounded and returned safely to the base, but immediately took off again. Together with navigator F. Bondarenko, he hurried to the aid of Sirotin. Aiche was shot down in the same place. Fortunately, and this time the fall was safe, both pilot and navigator survived. And then all three of them found themselves in one of the detachments of the 6th Brigade. The situation was difficult, and they could not send them to the Soviet rear for a long time. The pilots turned into partisans for a while and fought on the ground. They were in the practice of our aviators and such flights, which could well give food for the script of a thriller movie. Here is one of them. Leningrad headquarters of the guerrilla movement ordered to deliver to the Soviet rear of the head of the Pskov Inter-District Party Center V.F. Mikhailov. There were no partisan airfields nearby, and the underground decided to organize the landing of our plane on an enemy airfield near Pskov. This airfield was temporarily not used by the Germans. Only a platoon of guards was left on it. The operation was carefully prepared. The inhabitants of a neighboring village had stocked a considerable amount of moonshine, and on September 14, knowing that it was the birthday of a non-commissioned officer of the airfield guard, they made it so that the Germans got this moonshine. They organized a first-rate drunken party and were having fun so self-consciously that they could not hear anything around them. Meanwhile, pilot V.L. Semenov landed his U-2 on the airfield, took Mikhailov and quietly took off. The guards guessed that under their noses something happened at night, only the next day when, sobered up, found on the snowy virgin snow tracks of airplane skis. T-157 sorties to the partisans made pilot I. Shkov 138 BEIU. Route 117, the commander of the link N.I. Sinitsyn. About them and many others I would like to tell, but the volume of the book does not. Therefore, I will give only an excerpt from the order of the chief of the LSPDM, and Nikotin on the results of combat activity of the 4th Air Regiment. June 28, 1944. The Leningrad partisans, in their unprecedented, heroic struggle against fascist robbers, received considerable help and support from the 4th Separate Aviation Regiment of the Civil Air Fleet, which served during the period from August 1942 to May 1944, the needs of the partisan movement in the Leningrad region. During this time, thanks to the good work of the flight crew of the regiment, 2762 commanders and fighters of partisan detachments and underground party workers were thrown into the enemy's rear. In April 1943, in less than 7 days, the 450-man partisan brigade of Comrade Brednikov, with all combat equipment and the necessary food supply, was transported to the rear of the enemy for combat work on the most important enemy communications by U-2 and R-5 airplanes. The regiment delivered to the rear of the enemy guerrilla brigades, and detachments more than 15,000 rifles and machine guns, 16 million different cartridges, 170 tons of explosives, 180 tons of food, more than 5 million copies of newspapers and leaflets, as well as medicines, engineering and other property. About 2,000 wounded partisans were taken out of the enemy rear. In total, the regiment made 3,038 combat night sorties, 629 of them with landing in the enemy rear. Following exemplary fulfillment of combat missions of the Leningrad headquarters of the partisan movement, 198 people of the flight technical staff of the regiment were awarded orders and medals of the USSR, and 68 people, medals partisan of the patriotic war. Set intense attention, we followed the situation on the war fronts. The summer of 1943 was rich in events, which after the victory at Stalingrad were eagerly awaited by everyone. We believed that Hitler's troops would be dealt a new powerful blow and we lived in expectation of. But the first reports about the unfolding giant battle were for us, who did not know, of course, the plans of the Soviet command, alarming. On July 5, Hitlerites from the regions of Orel and Belgorod began a powerful attack on Kursk, aiming to dismember the Soviet troops at the base of the Bulge. Wedged many kilometers into the defense of the Wehrmacht troops, Hitler's generals hoped to cut off this bulge, isolate it, encircle, and then destroy the Red Army units fighting on this section of the front. The plan was essentially the same thing that was realized at Stalingrad, only this time our armies were to be in the cauldron. However, the plans of the Nazis were not allowed to materialize. The Soviet command waited for this blow, was well prepared for it, had enough forces to retaliate. The offensive was stopped, the enemy was forced to go on the defensive, and then it was struck first by the Western and Bryansk fronts, which moved on July 12 in a decisive counter-offensive against the Orel grouping of the enemy, and then on July 15, the Central Front by August 18, after fierce multi-day battles finally lost the initiative. Hitlerites were thrown back to the line southeast of Bryansk. See over the road. 3. The counter-offensive of the Voronezh and steppe fronts against the Belgrade-Kharkov grouping of the enemy troops began. On August 5, Orel and Belgorod were liberated, and on August 28, Kharkov. For 50 days of continuous fierce battles, the Red Army troops completely defeated 30 Hitler divisions, 7 of which were tank divisions. The enemy lost more than 500,000 soldiers and officers. The Battle of Kursk put an end to the offensive strategy of Hitler's command. So the radical turning point in the Great Patriotic War was completed. The strategic initiative seized by the Red Army at Stalingrad finally secured for her. All this responded to the despondency in the ranks of Hitler's armies and a new upsurge of armed popular struggle in the enemy rear. Before our eyes developed the very process that the consequences were described in the history of the CPSU in the following words. The guerrilla movement in 1943 became a mass movement, turned into a formidable force for the enemy. The guerrilla movement was widespread in the occupied regions of the RSSR, Leningrad, Orel, Smolensk and Kalinin, in the Ukraine, Belarus and the Crimea. It grew rapidly in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova. By the end of 1943, there were over 1 million armed partisans. On my desk lay a radiogram. I looked at the form just brought by the radio operator on duty. My mind was jumping with thoughts. Fragments of memories flashed and immediately disappeared, forming an unbelievable confusion, and through it all were the words written in pencil. On the night of September 5/6, Hermann died. Somehow I couldn't concentrate for a particularly long time. We all realized, of course, the very real possibility that any one of us might be killed. We had long ago gotten used to this thought, and probably that is why we seldom returned to it. When the surroundings are quiet, there is no reason to darken our existence by thinking about death. But in battle, in moments of real threat, there is simply no time to think about it. And every death hurt my heart. How many of my combat comrades died? Pikarchuk, Savchenko, Kaish, Gusev, Kurbit, Karchenko, Glebov, Pushkin, Pakhomov, Vasiliev A., and now Hermann. It would seem that we should have gotten used to everything, but consciousness stubbornly refused in the first minutes to accept this terrible news. Died. I could not believe that Sasha Hermann was gone, that only our memory of him remained, and now the most that we can do for him is to pass this memory to people and to take care that it would be eternal. Under the obituary, published on September 14, 1943 in the newspaper for the Soviet motherland, is my signature. But even then, I remember, everything in me resisted the cruelty of what had happened. Later being summoned to Leningrad, I read in the headquarters of the partisan movement the report of the head of the political department of the 3rd Brigade, M.L. Voskresensky. This document gives the most accurate representation of the circumstances of Alexander Viktorovich's death. In the early days of September, the Germans began a major punitive expedition, directed mainly against the partisans of the 3rd Brigade. On September 5, 1943, the brigade stood in the area of the villages of Sharika and Stanki in the Novorzevsky district of the Kalinin region. Having drawn large forces to this area, the Germans in the first half of the day started a battle in the areas of the 2nd and 1st regiments, and by evening the brigade's deployment was encircled from all sides. All day long German airplanes circled over the disposition of the detachments and dropped leaflets. These leaflets read, "You are surrounded by 6,000 German soldiers. Your resistance is pointless. Surrender as prisoners. All surrendered partisans will be treated in the same way as captured Red Army soldiers. The leaflet confirmed once again that we were dealing with an organized punitive expedition. The brigade command decided to withdraw from the area of the expedition to the southeast. The brigade moved out with the onset of darkness. To eliminate the enemy ambushes, which were to be met on the way of our movement, Alexander Viktorovich ordered to allocate a combat detachment at the village of Zitnitsa. The regiment of Comrade Kudiakov, going ahead of the column, was shelled by an ambush of Germans located on the heights and in the village itself. Later it was found out that in Zitnitsa there was not an ambush, but a garrison of 500 men and the headquarters of the punitive expedition group. There was only one way out: to defeat this garrison and leave the enemy ring with a fight. Kudiakov's Leningrad regiment broke through the German defense, broke into the village and passed through with a fight. In this battle fell a heroic death Regimental Chief of Staff Comrade Boykov and the head of the regiment's sanitary service Comrade Dobryak. The regiment commander Comrade Kudiakov was seriously wounded. The 4th Regiment of Comrade Efimov, which was following Kudiakov's regiment at that time, was much weaker in combat, as its personnel consisted mainly of people who had recently joined the units and had not yet been sufficiently shelled. Therefore, the 4th Regiment was unable to take advantage of the breakthrough and follow Kudiakov's regiment. The enemy immediately closed the passage again. Calm. Hermann, seeing the confusion of the 4th Regiment, gave the order to Detachment Nochenevan, which was moving with the brigade headquarters behind the 4th Regiment, to move forward, and himself led the detachment to storm the height occupied by the enemy, with a Mauser in his hand, with the cry, "Find forward! For the motherland!" Alexander Viktorovich rushed at the Germans. The soldiers rushed after Alexander Viktorovich. Punishers from the heights were shot down. Together with Comrade German went his adjutant Comrade Lemeshko and the chief of staff of the brigade Comrade Krylov. Lemeshko was wounded. Alexander Viktorovich sent him back. Continuing to go forward, Alexander Viktorovich told me, "I am wounded." When he was offered to go to the sanitary unit, he sharply refused. Just as sharply he refused to be bandaged when a nurse approached him. "For already wounded," Alexander Viktorovich shouted. "Friends, forward to the village." The detachment stormed into Zhitnitsa. The fascists desperately resisted. They threw grenades from around the corners, fired machine guns and automatic weapons, but the guerrillas, led by their favorite commander, crushed the Germans until they knocked them out of the village. Hermann, together with the detachment, ran into the village. Next to him was a wounded chief of staff of the brigade Comrade Krylov and his adjutant Comrade Sinelnikov. Sinelnikov recounts an exounded in the head. He cried out and fell down, having the wounded Krylov in his arms. Sinelnikov removed the equipment from the killed man. At this time, the Germans opened a hurricane fire on the village, and all attempts to carry the body of the commander failed. Lomovtsev, with a group of scouts a day later, snuck to the battle site, skillfully hiding, bypassing enemy garrisons and ambushes. The scouts penetrated into the village Vitnitsa, found the body of Alexander Viktorovich, took it out, put it on a cart, and in the daytime, at great risk of running into the Germans, brought it to the brigade 30 km away. The German garrison in the village of Zitnitsa was defeated. There were 370 enemy corpses, 8 burned vehicles, 1 gun, 1 mortar, 33 horses, and 5 carts with ammunition on the streets of the village and on its approaches. The brigade left the expeditionary ring in the area of Rugodevsky forests. Hermann's body was transported by airplane to the Soviet rear. Alexander Viktorovich was buried on Freedom Square in Valdai, next to Nikolai Grigorievich Vasilyev.